The medieval period. The dates for the medieval period are 350 to 1400. This is our first historical period, and there isn't a lot of change that happens throughout this 1,050-year period of time. So we'll be able to talk about the first 800 years of the medieval period in just a few minutes. I want you to go and listen to a chant by Hildegard von Bingen, which you'll see her name on the slide, and listen to her O Pastor Animarum, and see what you think about that. And pause me for a second and then come back. Now that you're back, what did you hear? Hopefully what's recurring in your mind is me talking about one of the textures of music, monophony. Gregorian chant, also known as plain chant or plain song, all of these are monophonic in texture, meaning that they only have one melody line. They are sung a cappella. There's no instrumental accompaniment. You just have that succession of single pitches, that horizontal line that we talked about when we were defining the term melody. The chants, though, are also very free-flowing. They don't use a lot of accents. They're very conjunct in their texture. So all of these things were discussed as we were going through the materials of music. There's a reason for this. Gregorian chants were used for one particular purpose. They were used within the confines of the Roman Catholic Church in their everyday worship service, their musical portion of their worship service called the Mass. The language was Latin, and these were sung prayers. And the church felt that the text, there was no one word, not even one syllable of the text, that was more important than anything else. So they wanted the singing to be very balanced, to be very even. You wouldn't have this sudden crescendo to this particular word or particular note. You wouldn't have an accent given to a particular word, because that would have brought more emphasis to that particular word in the text. And they wanted to avoid that at all costs. So Gregorian chant is a lot of times described by my students in my live classes. I'll say, what do you hear? And they'll say, well, it's boring. And to our ears today, yes, it is. But there's also something refreshing, something very peaceful about listening to this music. And again, that's one of the connections that it has to this particular church. Why is it called Gregorian? Originally, these chants were passed down orally from generation to generation. As time went on, more melodies were created for the sung moments within the Mass, until we get to Pope Gregory. Pope Gregory was born sometime around 540, and he passed away in 604. One of his one of the reasons why he's remembered so well is because he issued a decree to the church to codify, was his word, or document the chants. Now, Pope Gregory was not a musician. He was not a composer. He did not compose any of the lines of chant, but his name is now associated with the whole of this body of music because of him, we now have it in some sort of detailed format. We have something on paper that we can look at. Pope Gregory and a lot of the other music directors and many members of the choirs at all the different monasteries and convents and churches, they couldn't remember the difference between some of the melodies. Dependent upon the time of the day or the day of the week or the season of the church year, you might have one melody that's being used for the Kyrie eleison at 9 o'clock in the morning, but then at the noon saying of the Mass, you're going to use a different melody for the Kyrie. You're going to use a different melody for the Kyrie eleison in September than what you would in December and what you would in April. So many different melodies for one individual text, and it was beginning to be impossible to remember the difference. So because of Pope Gregory, we have this in documented fashion today, and that's wonderful. If you were taking art appreciation, then you might also talk about the Gregorian chants in terms of fine art. Once Pope Gregory issued his decree, then a lot of the monks, a lot of the nuns, took it upon themselves to create these wonderful works of art to go along with the ebb and flow of the melody of the line of music that people were going to sing. So take a look at the PowerPoint where I have a picture of the beginning of a chant. Now this one is not incredibly beautiful. It has a lot of geometrical figures around the first letter. What they would do is they would take the first word of the prayer that was going to be sung, and they would take the first letter of that word and make it this huge uppercase. And then around it, they would paint or draw these elaborate scenes, many of which were stories from the Bible that they were very familiar with, or maybe it was scenes, landscape from around the monastery or the church where they lived and where they served God. And so today, these individual parchment pages of chant that have these artistic designs can command millions of dollars when they come up at auction. So some of them were very, very beautiful. Oil paintings, watercolors of that nature. Those of you that do not read music, you would love these because they are just an indication of the ebb and flow of the melody, giving you the shape of when to move up or stay the same or when to move down. So this is how you would like music to be. They are not an indication of a particular pitch. These do not have tonality. These don't have harmony. They don't have a lot of the definitions that we've just gone through in the materials of music. So you have to kind of think of how we're moving through time. So the notes that you see on the page are not notes. They're not pitches. Instead, they're referred to as gnomes. These gnomes are just, again, the indication of the ebb and flow of the musical line. The melodies of these chants today fall under three different categories. During the 19th century, a group of English historians, English musicologists, must have been a great fun group, they got together and they put together all of the body of Gregorian chant into this huge book. They wanted to try and place them into chronological order as best as possible. But what they started to see was that there was some change during this 800 years. The early chants were more simplistic in their production than the later ones. So if you'll look at the three categories for chant melodies in your PowerPoint. The first category is syllabic. Earliest chant, so this will be around the time of Pope Gregory. You had one gnome being sung to one syllable of text. So it was very basic. As time moved forward, then you were going to start singing more gnomes to one syllable. So middle period of this 800 years, sometimes you have music that's more pneumatic in its setting, where you're singing two gnomes to one syllable, three gnomes to one syllable, or four gnomes to one syllable. The reason I go through this is because of our last category. Later chant, once you're getting close to the time of Hildegard of Bingen that you listened to a chant by her earlier, then it becomes more elaborate. And the name for this is melismatic. A melisma is when you're singing five or more gnomes in this case, or five or more notes later on when the notes come into play, to one syllable of text. Many of you love contemporary music, and whether it's soul, R&B, or pop or rock or whatever, think about your favorite artist. Christina Aguilera comes to mind because I was watching The Voice last night. And in some of her music, she does all of these elaborate runs, we call them, where she sings loads and loads of notes on one syllable. Well, the actual definition of that is a melisma. So later chant was much more melismatic than anything else. So these historians saw that what was happening throughout this 800 years of history is that we're becoming more ornate. At least, even though we just have one texture of music, there is some progress that's being made. So that's a musical interpretation of the music for the first 800 years. Now let's take a look at why it's important and what it's used for. I have a good friend who is the music director of a Roman Catholic church, and I've asked him on numerous occasions, can you give me some sort of definition of what the Mass is so that I can share that with my music appreciation students? And he just laughs at me every time I ask, because it's hard to put the Mass into a nice, neat box and come up with a plain definition for it. So I wanted to try and describe it for you a little bit this morning. The Mass constitutes a reenactment of the final days of Christ. When we think about the last week of Christ's life, there is Palm Sunday that we celebrate in the church, and that is the representation of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And then things kind of go downhill as we go through the rest of the week. As the week progresses, we have the Last Supper, the betrayal in the garden, the prayers. That's Maundy Thursday. On Good Friday is the crucifixion. And then on the third day, Easter, Sunday morning, he rises again. And so every time you're going through the Mass, you're supposed to remember that ultimate sacrifice that Christ made for our lives. As we go through the semester, since a lot of this music is tied to the church, we'll be having little Sunday school classes. And so in our next segment, I want to pick up with that thought of what the Mass indicates to us and talk about the church liturgy and talk about the church calendar year. See you next time.